Hey everyone! It has always been my belief that one must truly understand the nuances and complexities of African American history and culture to gain a full appreciation for African American art. So in this video, I offer you a look at some of the most important texts and scholars and art historians, curators that you should check out if you're interested in learning more about African American art history. So historiography. That's a long and interesting iteration of the word history, right? But what exactly is it, and why is it important? Well, for starters, historiography is the study of historical writing, or the study of the writing of history. So to gain a fuller knowledge of African American artists, their various styles, the various movements, etc., and to become a more informed collector, curator, artist, or enthusiast yourself, you should know what Black scholars and curators have actually said about Black art throughout history. African American art history gained momentum as a scholarly field over 50 years ago. However, concepts regarding the importance of Black people to Western art and the overall contributions of African American, African diasporic, craftsmen, and fine artists to Western culture began germinating among African American intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. For instance, scholars like Freeman Henry Morris Murray, who was one of the founders of the Niagara movement in 1905 with W.B. Du Bois, he wrote the first book about the importance of the Black figure in Western art, particularly sculpture, in 1916. You had other people like Dr. Benjamin Brawley, who published several works throughout the first decade of the 20th century that focused specifically on Black achievements in the fine arts and literature. However, figures such as Alain Locke, W.B. Du Bois, James Porter, Dr. David Driscoll, and Dr. Samella Lewis dedicated their careers to establishing the African American canon. So as stated in my previous video, African American art history began to take shape in 1925 when Alain Locke published The New Negro, which again was an extended version of the March 1925 issue of Survey Graphic magazine. The issue showcased the literary and scholarly works of most of the leading Black artists, writers, thinkers of the time. So the anthology included poems and short stories by artists like Jean Toomer, whose 1923 novel Cain remains a modernist classic in American literature, James Weldon Johnson, who's most notable for writing Lift Every Voice and Sing, but he was the first executive president of the NAACP. He was appointed in 1920. He was the first African-American faculty member hired at NYU. Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Angelina Well Grimke all have pieces that appear in The New Negro as well. And Jessie Fawcett, who was a prolific writer during the Harlem Renaissance and after, and she co-edited the NAACP's Crisis magazine along with Du Bois, but Du Bois's visibility often overshadows Fawcett in the histories. And her contribution, so I'm always a proponent of giving my sisters the credit that they deserve. So I had to highlight her here. The New Negro also contained a qualitative analysis of the Black middle class by famed sociologist E. Franklin Frazier. And it ended with a wonderful essay by Arthur Schomburg, the Afro-Puerto Rican collector, writer, and activist whose private collection comprises the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York today. After the publication of The New Negro, Locke went on to publish two more works on African American art, most notably The Negro in Art, which he published in 1940. But it was 1943 when James Porter published Modern Negro Art, which was the first successive study to add to Locke's beginnings. At the time of its publication, and for nearly 25 years after, Modern Negro Art was the only work of its kind. Porter, who was trained as both a visual artist and an art historian, famed professor at Howard University, gives the first in-depth art historical analysis of African American art that combines artist biography, art criticism, and a broader historical contextualization to provide a comprehensive history of African American artists. African American art doesn't see its next valuable scholarly treatment until the publications of the seminal art historian and artist Samella Lewis. Lewis really helped to establish African American art and art history as academic disciplines. In 1969, she and her dear friend and colleague, the artist and activist Ruth Waddy, established Black Artists on Art, which was the first anthology written by practicing artists or practicing Black artists on Black art. In 1976, Lewis founded the International Review of African American Art, and in 1978 published Art African American, which became the second survey text of African American art from the colonial period to the 20th century. Lewis, a brilliant painter and printmaker in her own right, is one of the giants of American art and art history who is still living. And if you'd like to learn more about Ruth Waddy, check out this recent discussion between art historians Kelli Jones and Bridget Cooks. Another seminal moment in African American art history happened in 1976 when Dr. David Driscoll's exhibition, 2 Centuries of Black American Art, opened at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. A show that surveyed the depths of artwork produced by African Americans from the colonial period to the 1970s, Driscoll's exhibition demonstrated just how central and integral African American visual production and artistic style has been to the overall American art and visual culture for centuries. The 90s saw 2 important publications, Sharon Patton's African American Art and Richard Powell's Black Art and Culture in the 20th Century. Patton's work is essential in that it was the next extensive historical treatment of African American art since Porter's. She uses African American artists in their works to create a comprehensive African American cultural history. African American experiences are covered so thoroughly in the work, it could be used as the intro to any African American history course. And she places the artist and the work in proper historical and political context, which use the visual as a basis for the overall study of African American history. Rick Powell's text is important in its application of a postmodernist theoretical framework and applying that analysis to African American art. His, too, is a really deep cultural history of African American experiences. However, he also includes African American performance art, digital art, and film to his presentation of African American visual work. The 21st century has seen an upsurge of scholarly publications in African American art history. Lisa Farrington's African American Art, A Visual and Cultural History is the most current textbook for teaching AFAM art history. Its historical contextualization, along with comprehensive visual analysis, is superb. I'm actually using it right now for one of my classes. And from Thelma Golden's landmark exhibitions Black Male and Freestyle to Deb Willis's tremendous establishment of the history of African American photography, current scholars utilize a myriad of methodologies to investigate not just African American, but African diasporic artistic trends and practices in both folk and fine art. These work range from artist biographies to exhibition catalogs to analytical studies that clearly demonstrate that Black people have created brilliant visual work all over the world for centuries and continue to do so for various cultural, aesthetic, and political reasons. BIA preserves, documents, and promotes the contributions of the African American arts community. This content is made free of charge. To support our efforts, please visit buyblackart.com. Live with the art you love.